My name is Victor Ponce, and I'm a professor of civil engineering at San Diego State University. When I started my career, it was in hydraulic engineering in the 70s. But over the years, it has evolved, and now I consider myself a water engineer. Broadly speaking, we deal with problems of water, water resources, environmental, social, political. My initiation in ecology was when I did a project in the wetland of central Brazil in 1995. We had to learn everything else besides the water. We learned that the water operates in an environment where there is plants and animals and people. So it was not just water by itself. At that point, I realized that I had to learn more about other fields. So we started reviewing or learning the field of ecology and geomorphology, which is very important, and geology. So those three fields underpin the science of water. At the beginning, it was the feeling that we felt that there was a need, societal need for water management. But then eventually we learned to love it, I guess. We now believe that it's a good field, and as many people know now, it is the field to be in because particularly here in California, we're running out of water resources. We always have to worry about either floods or droughts or yield or relationship between the water, or I guess you could say the issue whether what part of the hydrologic cycle belongs to the plants and what part belongs to the people. That's a very large issue that has not been totally determined or decided yet. Our involvement in Tierra del Sol started about 10 years ago. Specifically, it was, I believe, in November of the year 2005. I was invited to give a lecture over at Campo here, very close to this area, and that's where I met a group of people from this area that were interested in the water resources and the water management in this region. So from there on, I've been involved with Tierra del Sol and Boulevard in water issues. It has taken me into a field that I did not necessarily train for, which was groundwater. But it's all related. There's only one water cycle, and it's composed of groundwater and surface water. And there's no compartment. They're not separated. It's not two. It's only one. The situation, of course, with water has to do with either water quality or water quantity or both. When we started here 10 years ago, it was mostly water quality because of the issues with the so-called Campo landfill. But then eventually when that issue subsided, there were other issues, and they dealt mostly with the water quantity. The issue of the basic underlying issue here is who owns the groundwater. And since the groundwater is technically a commons, it needs to be decided in common what to do with it. Most people don't realize that there's a connection. Therefore, the groundwater eventually becomes surface water, and likewise, surface water can become groundwater. Using groundwater could eventually mean that you're actually using the surface water because there's a connection. So that leads to very complex issues which have yet to be resolved, by the way. Most people would consider the groundwater problem as a yield problem, meaning how much water can we pump. But that's not quite correct, because the actual question is how much water that you can pump can you afford not to turn into surface water. That is a very important issue, because every groundwater pumping will eventually affect the surface water in the vicinity. It may be far, it may be short, but it is still an effect in the vicinity. There is a lot of groundwater. People that know say that there is at least 100 times more groundwater than surface water. Unfortunately, it's not replenishable. So if you use it, you could lose it. While surface water is totally replenishable in the short time. It takes about 11 or 12 days to replenish all the surface water on the mean, on the average, global. So most people, or it hasn't been really understood that groundwater is not replenishable. So if you use groundwater, eventually you will run out of groundwater. So ideally, we shouldn't be using groundwater. However, that's a very strong statement. Society's been using groundwater for 100 years. We're not just going to stop the usage of groundwater all of a sudden. It's like we know that cars produce global warming, but we're not going to stop immediately all of a sudden. We got to gradually grow into something presumably more sustainable. So there's the issue of sustainability, which cannot be resolved in 2 years or even in a generation. You got to set forth the procedures that will allow us to eventually reach sustainability. In this case, we're talking about here specifically, if too much groundwater is pumped, it will affect the surface water. And the surface water is not just running surface water, it's also evapotranspiration. As we have seen in this range, several trees have been either impaired or actually killed because of the pumping of groundwater in the vicinity. Everybody knows what an oasis is. An oasis is an oasis in the Sahara, a tree, a lone palm tree out there in the middle of the desert, right? But it is in a depression. And interestingly, the water flows underground and it pumps through the ground and it feeds the lone tree. In here, we don't have a lone tree. We have a desert also. This is an area, the San Diego is a desert. This area here, it rains on the order of 11 or 12, 13 inches per year, average precipitation. And that's not enough to sustain normal vegetation that would require more water. So the vegetation that is sustained in here is the chaparral. This is chaparral country. And among the chaparral, there is one particular tree, which is a species of chaparral, which is adapted through millions of years to get more water and therefore to grow taller. And that species is the red shank. Now, with the help of Donna Tisdale here, we have identified, or I guess you could say they have identified over years, the lineaments, which are surface expressions of the location of groundwater exfiltrating onto the surface. And these are typically along straight lines because the rock underground breaks or fractures along straight lines because it's crystalline rock. And that's the way it has a way of doing, right? It's not curved, it's actually straight. Therefore, the presumption, and that's why our project is important, is that along the lines of those fractures is where we're going to have the lineaments. And among the lineaments, and we have hundreds of lineaments around here, the red shank is the most visible and the easier to identify by visual appearance, because the red shank grows to 7 meters or 21 feet, while the chaparral stays at 3 meters or as say 10 feet. A lineament is a vegetative feature of the ecology or the ecosystem where you can see lengthwise patterns of certain types of vegetation. And in this area, we have many lineaments that have been documented. Only that they're not very easy to see. You can only see them with remote sensing. You can't really see them unless you're right there. And even then, you need some remote sensing, special features to or help in order to identify it. However, the linear oasis of red shank, or I guess you could say the vegetative lineament, it's also, we could also call it a linear forest. The linear forest of red shank over here is readily identifiable. And anybody could say, oh yeah, right, this is right here. We intend to show that groundwater is tied to the surface water completely without, you can't separate them. And when you pump groundwater, you lower the water table and then the vegetation will suffer. Because this particular vegetation, like the oasis of red shank, is in what we call the uplands. It's not next to the river, it's off the river, it's the upland. And therefore, the only way that vegetation can sustain itself is through the fractures. The springs, and we've seen the springs, which pop up from the groundwater. Without those springs coming out, the vegetation will not exist. The fact that this particular linear oasis has been here for as far as we can remember, it means that if we leave it the way it is and do not pump the groundwater, it will remain. If we continue to pump the groundwater in an uncontrolled fashion and unmonitored or not monitored, the linear oasis and the vegetation associated with it will die, as it has happened here and in other places around here. So our purpose is to defend the oasis. When I started civil engineering 50 years ago, 45 years ago, I thought that I was going to deal with concrete and perhaps with soil, because that's what engineers do. I never thought, as I say in a blue moon, that I was going to be dealing with vegetation. I started looking at the vegetation, recognizing the trees, educating myself in the various types of vegetation, and we started our career in ecohydrology, which is a new field. It's a combination of ecology and hydrology. It's a field that had been around only for 10 to 20 years. It's a formal field. In an area like ecohydrology, which is between ecology and hydrology, you feel that you know more than just a hydrologist or just an ecologist, because those people are shortchanged. They don't know. The hydrologist would know the hydrology, but they don't know about the ecology, and vice versa. We sit in the middle and we know, we presume to know, we claim to know both. And in fact, we do. We have several publications in this field. And I can tell you there's many colleagues of mine around the world that have gotten into this field of ecohydrology. And it's really mushroomed or boomed in the last 10 years. There's actually 5 or 6 books written on the subject. We have learned how to respect nature. We thought we didn't, or we didn't care about it too much. We were going to do our thing. But we ended up finding out that there's nature out there, and we got to learn from her, and we got to respect her, because she's been around longer, much longer than we have. And that's really the essence of this whole thing. Let's say that the weather brought me out here. That's everybody's answer. But there was more. We wanted to come to California, for one thing. And I just felt that my kids were young and we needed a place like here to. We used to live in Colorado, and I'm not demeaning Colorado. Colorado was fine to go to school, but perhaps California was better to live. Most people move because they have a job. Sure. I moved because to San Diego because I had a job, and then we started teaching, and one thing, if you care to listen, I was not a computer expert. I was a water expert. But when I came over here, the head of the department said, "Ponce, we need somebody to teach computers. Can you do it?" I had to say yes, and I did. And after 30 years, I became a computer expert. I know more computers than a whole lot of people out there. I have almost half of my activity in computers and the other half in everything else. And I owe that to the fact that I was kind of pushed into teaching computers. At the time it was Fortran, then it became other things. Now we use PHP in order to develop these calculators, and we've got hundreds of these calculators which we use or populate all over the world. We would not have done that had we not started teaching Fortran in the 80s. The story, 1994, was when the World Wide Web Consortium was created. And in 1995, they set up a lab out there at San Diego State to do this online stuff. And most faculty at the time, of course, didn't know anything about it. And I kind of resisted at the time, really. Professor Ponce resisted getting into online. The resistance took about maybe 3 or 4 years, but it kept coming back at us, and I realized that it was important. I delved into it and I said, heck, this stuff is the up-and-coming thing. So one day I decided I was going to do it, and I started from the bottom. I picked up a book on HTML, and it hasn't stopped yet since. That was 1999. I picked in March of 1999, and it hasn't stopped yet. We consider ourselves expert on HTML, and most people don't know that, by the way, or they don't get into that. In other words, we will code everything up, absolutely everything. We don't use code generators. We code everything. And I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it makes sense, a heck of a lot of sense to us, because that has allowed us to become big. Once we did the HTML for a while, then the technology evolved, and HTML became JavaScript not became, but it allowed the development of JavaScript, and then one thing led to another, and pretty soon in the year 2000, 2001, we had this tool called PHP, which allowed us to do interactive web, meaning calculation. You can ask questions and answers. So we started getting into PHP. I asked my technician, my administrator, what can we do? And he says, oh, well, we have a thesis. You can review it. So, master's thesis. So we started getting in the year 2004 into PHP, 3 years late, by the way, but we did. And that led to the development of the calculators. We started very, very small, doing calculators that would do 3 or 4 calculations just for the heck of it. But right now, we're doing calculations that could do 30, 40 million calculations in no time, hardly any time. So very complex algorithms have been programmed through PHP into the web for the benefit of everybody. Now, we did this for ourselves. We just don't mind sharing it to the world or with the world. In other words, I can do a calculator, and I do it for me because it simplifies my work. It's just that I post it on the web and everybody could use it. My website, during school session, we recently measured it, it has about 130 hits per day. And oft times when there's no students hitting the website, it's about 80. Since I hit my website 10 or 15 times per day, obviously, right? Or my students, the people who work with me, it can be assumed that there's 60 or 70 users daily of my website. What do they do? I don't know. I don't track that. I don't have the time to do that. I could be tracking all the IPs generated, but I don't do that because I don't have the time. But I know positively my website is being used around the world by all kinds of people because we get recognition. We get people calling us out of the blues saying, thanks, we use your calculator. For instance, a calculator to design the normal depth in an open channel, okay? That is it's an iterative calculation. And if you had to do it by hand, it will take you 2 hours. If you did a spreadsheet, it will be faster, but you have to develop the spreadsheet. So it will be some time involved. With this calculator, you don't need a spreadsheet, you don't need hand, you don't need anything. Just go in there, plug the 5 values that are required, and bang, you get an answer. And that's just one example of 300 or 400 products. But there could be 1,000, it could be 5,000, it could be 1,000,000. We have calculators of all kinds. A one-on-one calculator is the one that everybody is the most common, the most in need by everybody, how to figure out the normal depth. But we have sophisticated calculators like the one that calculates the sag, the DO-sag curve. It's the dissolved oxygen sag curve. In a river or stream, if you put in there sewage, then the DO, which usually stands at about 8 to 9, normal concentration, will start to drop, and it'll drop to 7, 6, 5. By the time it gets below 5, it's out of the norm or out of regulation, and the fish start to die. And by the time it gets to 3, most of the good fish would have died. And of course, by the time it gets to 0, it becomes anoxic, and there's no oxic, or meaning oxygen-based life in the river. And at that point, anoxic life starts to develop, and the river starts to smell. Now, an engineer can do, in 1/10 of the time, 10 times more than what he or she could possibly do before. Because he or she can do 10 runs in 1/10 of the time. Before, it would take hours to do this sort of thing. With the calculators, particularly the ones that we have with our calculators, an engineer could do in 1/10 of the time 10 times more than what used to be done in the past without the calculators. That is a tremendous productivity issue here. You wouldn't believe the speed acquired. Most people, when they visit my lab, particularly the students, are amazed at the speed at which we do things. The productivity of our lab and our productivity is tremendous. We boast 15,000 links constructed in 15 years. So we put, on the average, 1,000 links per year. That means 3 links per day. We have several students. Typically, we have 3 or 4 students every year. They come to the lab at various times and occasions. They come from all over the world. We have a lady from India, another lady from Mexico, and another gentleman now from Mexico. And we just graduated a lady from Oakland, California, about a year ago. And just last year, we graduated a gentleman from the Ukraine. We have an international grad student population, which is not unusual in our field, by the way. Engineering at San Diego State is international, totally international. We recently published several papers, as a matter of fact, with our students. We are now in line to present 6 papers at the Latin American Hydraulics Conference in Lima, Peru in September. We have 6 papers lined up for publication there. We not only teach the students hydraulics, we teach them other things besides hydraulics. How to operate in this world, how to navigate through the various requirements, circumstances, limitations, how to persist, how to know when not to persist. That's very important. The work in Tierra del Sol has to do with ecohydrology and groundwater and the relationship between groundwater and vegetation. We had a project in 1998 in Mexico, in Ojos Negros, Baja California, where that was the beginning of our groundwater work. That was like the other project. Remember I told you this was groundwater work. We developed a groundwater model there, and a numerical model of groundwater. So therefore, we're not new to the groundwater area. We have developed models, which is much more to say than running models. Because as you know, in the world, there's model developers and model users. And 99.9% of the people are model users. If we pump the groundwater without control, the vegetation will eventually die. That, of course, is an impact on climate change. That has been documented. We certainly should not be in the business of killing vegetation. And if we do that, it should be the minimum absolutely necessary. Because the vegetation, as you know, they do the opposite of what the animals do. The animals breathe and the vegetations photosynthesize. And that becomes a complement to each other. CO2 vis-a-vis organic matter. But what has happened in our society the last 100 years is that we have produced these artificial animals, which are the machines, for at least 100, if not 200 years, while at the same time cutting the vegetation. So it's a double whammy. What we should have been doing, if we had known from the beginning, is for every artificial animal that we produce, we should have been producing an artificial vegetation or some natural vegetation to balance it out. But we didn't do that because we didn't know. That was 100 years ago. Now we know better, but still it's going to take us a while to backtrack. We need to realize, and we have to a large extent, that the state of California is blessed with all kinds of weather. We have very wet regions, very dry regions. We have some of the driest, east, southeast, and some of the wettest northwest, right? And yet the people for the last 100 years have chosen to live in the dry regions. So we had to, for 50 years now, bring the water from the wet regions. And we bring them to Southern California from the north and from the east. We bring them from the Colorado River. We pump a whole lot of water from the Colorado River and then from the north, and we provide water for the south. And that's why the south can develop for industry, for agriculture, for domestic uses. But we have to continuously provide water. So we have to make sure that that water, the continuance of that water is kept in the best way and manage it in a way that it can be sustained, so to speak. Because if population continues to increase, we're going to find eventually that there's no more water. Then we're going to have to start cutting. How do we cut? That's for the politicians to decide what to cut. First of all, we need to cut our usage, right? That's a political, actually, statement. We need to cut our usage of water. We need to be more efficient with the use of water. Another thing we need to do is perhaps, and this is a very, very strong political statement, to decide that perhaps we ought to send the people or encourage the people to move to areas where there's more water so that we wouldn't have to do a whole lot of transfer. That is up and coming. That will come in the next 20, 30 years. People are going to have to move back to where they came from, either north or east or west or south, because the water is going to be limiting. All of you know that we need the water.